Hi AP Econ students, Mr. Muller here, and in our last video, we're going to be talking about income inequality and poverty. In our last video, we noted that the market wages that get created in a market are the intersection, ideally, of supply and demand. However, what that equilibrium wage is can differ from country to country, from city to city, from state to state. So why do those wages get determined at those rates? Why is an equilibrium or market wage different in different places or for particular groups of people? Let's find out. Hope you're excited. I'm excited. Let's get started. So, what are the determinants of a wage, what you get paid for your job? Now, a lot of times it could be determined by compensating differentials, which is a situation where you have a very undesirable job like cleaning sewers or being a deep sea fisherman where you have a high rate of injury or death. And to offset those negative aspects of jobs, that firm raises the wage. And the idea is, as we looked at in our video last time, when you raise the wage, there's going to be a higher supply of workers. So that's how wages can be determined. Also, if you have a job that is very desirable because of how fun it might be or how easy it might be, that firm can lower the wages because there's still a large supply. There's also the idea of educations and human capital that determine wages. Human capital is the set of skills that you need to require through on-the-job training and through education, through doing trades, through experience, through education, getting a master's degree or a doctoral degree. And when human capital, or the amount of years you need in that particular field, is very high, the wages are high because it takes a long time for someone to get to have that set of skills to be in that firm, to be in that field and that job. So another thing that can influence can determine wages are location and lifestyle. So the idea of nonprofits versus for-profit businesses, the cost of living in different cities. If I'm moving to San Francisco, which the cost of living there is ridiculous, the rents there are ridiculous, I'm not going to get the same wage as if I'm in a know-nothing town in the middle of nowhere, because the cost of living in San Francisco is higher than living somewhere else, or the cost of living in London is higher than the cost of something else. So the wages have to match that so that people who work in that business can actually afford to live where their business is. You also have the idea of desirable versus non-desirable locations. I had an uncle who took a job, a 3-year contract, I believe, in Alaska. He was a water treatment specialist. And he took a job in Alaska because the wage was very high because it was a non-desirable location. Unions can also determine wages, which is when a group of workers come together and bargain for better wages and benefits. And they say, hey, we want this wage, we want these benefits for our workers, and if not, we will strike. We will stop working and we will hurt your bottom line, which is your business profits. So give us what we want. Other determinants, we have to talk about efficiency wages, which are higher than the equilibrium wages to increase worker productivity. So sometimes businesses will say, hey, we're going to give you a higher wage than if you were working at another, let's say I'm working at a fast food place. And I'm working at this particular fast food place, and I'm making more than if I was working at McDonald's, but with that added wage, I'm expected to increase my productivity, which means I'm going to be working at a higher rate to produce that output. Now, what a firm hopes is that will decrease turnover. People will stay in that business longer, and it gives incentives to be more productive because, hey, I'm getting paid more than if I was working at a different place. So I was working at this fast food restaurant instead of McDonald's, so I have higher expectations. I need to work more efficiently because I'm getting a better deal here. Also, people are less likely to leave. Now, if that doesn't happen, the firm can say, we're getting rid of you because we have higher expectations because we're offering efficiency wages. Now, there are issues of wage discrimination, which occurs when workers with the same ability as others are not paid the same because of their race, ethnicity, sex, age, religion, or whatever. Now, most of the time, wage discrimination affects women and minorities, historically based on the data that we have. Wage discrimination can also happen based on life cycle wage patterns, where as you get older, you're going to be making more and more money because you have more skills, more experience, you're going to demand a higher wage. But at some point, usually in the early 60s, they'll actually start to make less because the burdens of being older offset the experience and skills they may have. There's also the idea of occupational crowding, which affect wage discrimination, which is where you're saying a certain group of people can only have a certain type of job. And this happens in certain countries where for particular racial groups or ethnic groups, maybe women can only have these particular jobs. Maybe if you're a particular age, you can only have certain jobs, or certain religions, where because you're part of that group, you can only have these types of jobs. That's another type of wage discrimination. Now, there's also another type of wage discrimination called winner-take-all, which is when if you're a person that has some very small difference in ability, which mostly happens in sports, can lead to sizable differences in the amount of money you make. So the difference between LeBron James and a normal starter on a basketball team, an average starter, isn't really that different, even if they're the same height, same weight, but those small differences can lead in huge differences in compensation. Now, based on people's wages within a country or a state or a city, you're going to deal with something called income inequality, which is the difference between what the highest section of a population is making and what the lowest section of a population is making. So what's the difference between how much the richest are making and how much the poorest are making? So what can cause that are things like ability. So you don't have the physical or the intellectual strength to do certain jobs. You don't have a particular level of education. You only have a high school education instead of a college education. The amount of training that you only have 1 year of experience here as opposed to 10. Discrimination, as we talked about, can cause income inequality. The role of wealth. What we found, economists have found through data, is if you were born into a wealthy home, you're probably going to make more money than if you were born poor because of the head start you're getting in terms of the education that you're provided and the supplemental resources that you're given that you're not going to have if you were poor. Corruption can also cause income inequality as well. Now, how do we measure income inequality? We look at the income inequality ratio, which is what you do is you take the top 20%, let's say in a country, the top 20% richest, and you divide it by the bottom 20% poorest. So you divide that, and then you have an income inequality ratio. Now, this does not take into account taxes and subsidies. Now, highly developed countries usually have an income inequality ratio that's under 6. Now, what can skew that income inequality ratio is very affluent wealth or very extreme poverty. If you're in a country where the poverty is just extreme or the wealth is just absolutely affluent, that could skew the income inequality ratio. Now, to talk about a couple of issues in regards to poverty, you have a poverty threshold, which is the income level below which a person or family is considered impoverished. And the poverty rate in a country is the percentage of the population whose income is below that poverty threshold. So when we're trying to say, what is the poverty rate in a country, you first have to determine, well, what is the poverty threshold, and then whatever is below that. And it can be different country to country. The UN also has different estimates. Now let's take a look at this particular country. In this country, the top fifth, or 20% of the country, has this much wealth. The bottom fifth, the bottom 20%, has this much wealth. So if we divide these two, we're going to see their income inequality ratio is ridiculously high. If we are going by the rate of most highly developed countries, where you want that to be about 6, then you would want the top fifth to be having 18%, not 51% here. Now, how is income inequality measured? We do it by something called a Gini index, which measures the income distribution of a country's residents. Now, when we look at a map of a Gini index, or if we see a graphical representation of it, if you see a Gini index of 0, that is a completely equal society where there is no income inequality. If you have 100, it's ridiculous income inequality. Now, it's represented graphically by something we call a Lorenz curve. We're going to look at one in a second. So here's a map of the world, and you can see what the Gini index here is. Now again, 0 is complete equality, 100 is ridiculous inequality. So you can see based on this key, where are the more what countries have less income inequality and which ones have more. Now, if we're looking at a graphical representation of this, here we can see the Lorenz curve. Now, this green line indicates complete income inequality, which would be a Gini index of 0. And as income inequality increases, the curve is going to shift down and to the right. So this is the Lorenz curve. And that's how we can determine what the Gini index is. We take the section A here, we divide it by A, which is the section shaded, and the part below, and that will give us what the Gini index is. So here's another graphical representation of the Lorenz curve and the Gini index. So this green line represents a Gini index of 0, and this blue line represents the Lorenz curve of this particular country in 1968. Now we find the Gini index by taking this shaded section here and then dividing it by the entire triangle below the Gini index of 0. And so that would give you, in this particular case, a Gini index of 39. Whereas if we looked at the Lorenz curve in 2010, which we have more income inequality because it's going lower, the curve is going lower. If we were trying to calculate that, so we take this whole section between the Lorenz curve and a Gini index of 0, and then we divide that by the entire triangle, we would find that the Gini index here is 44. So income inequality has risen. Now, there are some issues in measuring income inequality because it doesn't account for disposable income and donations that people who are richer make to charities. So that can skew the income inequality ratio we find in a country. It doesn't take into account black markets. It's also difficult to measure over a long period of time. And it assumes income distribution as a direct reflection of society's well-being. So these are some things that make it difficult to measure income inequality. You're going to need to know these things in case you get asked a question like that on the AP test. Now, something else we have to talk about when it comes to income inequality is the idea of income mobility, which is how likely is it that someone could go from poor to rich or from rich to poor, the ability of workers to move up or down the economic ladder over time. Now, this reduces inequality over long periods of time if you have a lot of income mobility because people's decisions can either make them more successful or less successful economically. And it separates those at the bottom of the economic ladder into two groups. So if we're looking at the income mobility of a country and we're looking at the poorest section of that country, we have to classify what kind of poor are they. Are they marginal poor, which is what percentage of the poor people in that country could advance up the economic ladder with training or with education. So these would be things like people who are younger. And then you have long-term poor, which these people do not have the skills to be mobile in their income. So they can't climb into a higher economic bracket, maybe because of some sort of physical or mental disability, or if you're in a really corrupt country, because the system that they live in, the country that they live in, does not allow them to get the training or the education or the skills to climb up the mobility ladder. Well, that's all there is for this last lesson on income inequality and poverty. Hope you learned something you didn't know before. Thanks for watching.